November 19, 1944. Near Bourg-l'Altrou, France. A cold fog hugged the icy earth as a German anti-tank crewman peered through his sight at American Sherman tanks closing in. For 3 days his unit had been dueling with these same American tankers, and everything the Nazis had drilled into him about racial hierarchy now felt wrong. The lead Sherman, smoking and clearly battered, kept moving forward despite taking repeated hits. Through his optic, Schmidt made out the tank commander, unmistakably a black soldier, exposed in the turret and manning the .50 caliber machine gun despite the clear danger. That man was Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers, though Schmidt would only learn his name decades later when historians reconstructed the action. Gravely wounded with his leg cut down to the bone, Rivers refused morphine, would not be evacuated, climbed into another tank, and led his company forward into Gabling the next day. For 3 days he fought with a gangrenous injury that should have put any man out of action. What Schmidt saw in the moments before Rivers' tank was destroyed stayed with him for life. Not because of the brutality, but because it demolished every lesson of racial superiority he had been taught. The soldiers his propaganda labeled inferior displayed courage beyond anything he had seen in 5 years of war. The arrival of the 761st Tank Battalion in World War II meant far more than another American formation joining the fight. It brought 2 utterly conflicting world views into direct collision. Nazi racial doctrine meeting its refutation on the battlefield. The 761st's motto, "Come out fighting," was literal. From its first engagement in the small Belgian town of Morville-le-Vik in November 1944 through relentless combat until war's end, they fought ferociously. Their fighting had an added meaning that German troops would soon learn the hard way. Many of the German units facing them had been steeped since childhood in doctrines of racial superiority. Wehrmacht training texts bluntly declared that black soldiers could not manage complex equipment, lacked bravery, and would break under fire. These were not casual slurs, but core assumptions shaping German expectations. Over 183 straight days, the 761st would demonstrably overturn each of those assumptions. The battalion was formed on March 15, 1942, and officially activated on April 1, 1942, at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. That activation came not from enlightened policy, but from what War Department papers termed a political necessity to preserve Negro morale. Their route to combat differed from white units. The men of the 761st trained for nearly 2 years, while white armored units were routinely shipped overseas after only a few months. Where white battalions often deployed after 12-16 weeks, the 761st spent over 2 years mastering armored warfare, because any error would be judged as a racial failing rather than an individual mistake. Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates, the white commander assigned to lead them, had damaged his career prospects by taking the job. Bates was a World War I veteran who had seen colonial troops fight well, and he judged men on skill rather than skin color. After 2 years, he concluded the 761st was the best-trained tank battalion in the U.S. Army. Among those who proved him right was Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers of Holdenville, Oklahoma, a 6'2", farm-raised man Bates said had an instinctive feel for ground and tactics. There was Warren G. Crey, nicknamed Iron Man for his staggering stamina under fire. And there was the battalion's most famous member who never saw combat, First Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt Robinson, an athlete who would go on to transform baseball. Lost his combat opportunity after refusing to move to the back of a segregated military bus during an incident at Fort Hood, Texas, in July 1944. After the 2-year training period in Texas, the 761st received orders on June 9, 1944, to prepare for overseas movement, 3 days after D-Day. They crossed the Atlantic aboard the British troopship Esperance Bay and reached England on September 8, 1944. After a short stay, they landed in France, via Omaha Beach on October 10, 1944, and were quickly placed under General George S. Patton's Third Army. Patton's early doubts about black tank crews are well documented. He wrote to his wife expressing skepticism that they could think fast enough for armored warfare. Yet on October 28, 1944, he addressed the battalion and gave them a blunt, famous charge: He noted they were the first Negro tankers to fight in the U.S. Army, said he would not have asked for them if they were not capable, and declared he cared only that they went out and did their deadly duty. The message was simple. Performance mattered more than color. On November 7, 1944, the Black Panthers were fielded in combat as they assaulted the German-held town of Morville-le-Vik in support of the 26th Infantry Division. The Germans, a mix of Wehrmacht infantry and anti-tank teams, expected an easy victory against troops they had been told were inferior. The engagement lasted 4 hours. Inside the town, King's lead tank was put out of action by a German Panzerfaust. 2 of King's crew were wounded and dragged behind their tank to safety, and their comrades then neutralized the enemy soldier who had fired the weapon. German after-action files later noted with surprise the attacking unit's tactical skill. Where intelligence predicted panic after the first hit, the 761st carried out a coordinated assault that methodically removed German strongpoints. In another action, Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers ran into a roadblock that halted his tank column. Under heavy small arms fire, he jumped from his tank, rigged a cable from his Sherman to the obstruction, climbed back in, and had his vehicle tow the barrier clear so the column could continue. Rivers earned the Silver Star for that deed, the first of many honors the battalion would receive. November 1944 became a month of near constant. Fighting for the 761st, they were engaged for 183 consecutive days, and in that month alone suffered 156 casualties, 24 killed, 81 wounded, and 44 non-battle losses. The battalion also lost 14 tanks evacuated and had another 20 damaged in action. Those numbers, however, do not convey what German units were learning firsthand. The black tank crews they had been told would flee actually kept an operational pace surpassing many white American battalions. Whereas typical tank units were pulled back after 10-14 days, the 761st remained on the front without relief. German intelligence documents preserved in the Bundesarchiv begin to show bewilderment over these tankers' identity. One report from the 11th Panzer Division remarked that the enemy unit displayed exceptional vehicle upkeep and aggressive tactics inconsistent with prior assessments. The most dramatic proof of the 761st's grit came during the push on Gabling. On November 16, 1944, while advancing toward Gabling, Rivers' tank struck a mine at a railroad crossing. Severely wounded with his leg cut to the bone, he refused morphine and evacuation, took command of another tank, and led the company into Gabling. The following day, Captain David Williams, Rivers' company commander, repeatedly ordered him to leave the line. Rivers replied, according to Williams' report, "Captain, you know better than that. This is going to be tough. Another 2 days won't make any difference." A medic inspecting Rivers' swollen, infected leg shouted, "Listen, he's got gangrene." Williams barely had time to say Ruben before German guns opened up again and forced the Americans to take cover. At dawn on November 19, 1944, Company A's tanks moved toward Bugalto, their next objective only to be halted by enemy fire. Captain David J. Williams ordered a withdrawal into cover. Staff Sergeant Rivers, however, reported by radio that he had located German anti-tank positions. "I see them. We'll fight them," he said, and, joined by another Company A tank, opened fire on the enemy to cover his unit's withdrawal. While covering the withdrawal, Staff Sergeant Rivers' tank took a direct hit, killing him and wounding the remaining crew. Captain Williams immediately put Rivers forward for the Medal of Honor, but the recommendation would not be acted upon for another 52 years. On December 16, 1944, the Wehrmacht launched its last major offensive, Operation Watch on the Rhine, what Americans call the Battle of the Bulge. The 761st was attached to the 87th Infantry Division and hurled into the desperate effort to blunt the German push. They faced some of Germany's most capable formations, including elements of an elite brigade expanded from Hitler's personal escort battalion. The fighting around the Belgian town of Tillet was especially savage. Replacements were scarce, and many of the men assigned to the Black Panthers were green recruits or cast-offs from other units, poorly prepared for combat. Despite these inadequate replacements, the 761st kept fighting. Their Shermans and the infantry of the 87th Division ground forward against determined opposition at every turn. German forces included Tiger tanks with 88mm guns that could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm rounds could not pierce Tiger armor. The 761st adapted by exploiting mobility. They used speed to outflank heavier German tanks and relied on better mechanical reliability to keep more vehicles operational. One tanker, Sergeant Frank C. Cochran, radioed, "They've hit me 3 times, but I'm still giving them hell." By January 9, 1945, Tillet was in American hands. The 761st had helped stem the German offensive, but it had been costly. In February and March 1945, the battalion joined the assault on the Siegfried Line, Germany's final major defensive network, attached to the 103rd Infantry Division for the operation. Within days, the line was breached and surrendering enemy troops began moving forward in growing numbers. By March 23rd, the Black Panthers had destroyed hundreds of enemy vehicles and heavy weapons, inflicted roughly 4,000 casualties, and taken nearly as many prisoners. This fighting differed from earlier battles in France and Belgium. Now the unit advanced on German soil against increasingly desperate Wehrmacht and Volkssturm defenders. Still, German soldiers surrendered in larger numbers, especially when they confronted the black tankers whose existence had so shocked them. Prisoners, steeped in Nazi propaganda that painted black soldiers as savage and merciless, were often terrified at the prospect of capture by African-American troops. To avoid panic among surrendering men, the 761st's tank crews learned not to stick their heads up from hatches until the enemy was very close, so prisoners would not catch sight of their skin and bolt. That terror, born entirely of racist propaganda, proved baseless. The 761st treated captives according to the Geneva Conventions, often sharing rations and small comforts with the men they had just taken. As the battalion pushed into Germany in March 1945, they encountered scenes that exposed the regime's brutality. Many German civilians, steeped in years of racial indoctrination, fled when black soldiers arrived. Yet the Panthers held firm to discipline. There were no reprisals, no looting, no revenge attacks despite knowing the depth of hatred many civilians had been taught. Their professional conduct startled civilians who had expected the caricatured savagery portrayed by Nazi propaganda. Tank battles continued as the 761st penetrated deeper, facing Panthers, Tigers, and fanatical SS resistance. Warren G. Crey, Iron Man, distinguished himself in this phase by frequently dismounting at night, with an M1 Garand to perform close reconnaissance. One of the most wrenching episodes involving the 761st occurred in early May 1945. On May 2, the tankers liberated the Gunskirchen concentration camp in Austria, where they found roughly 15,000 Hungarian Jews on the verge of death from starvation. The sight that met the black soldiers was horrific. Thousands of emaciated figures, many too weak to stand. The SS guards had fled days earlier and left the prisoners to die. Technician 5th grade Johnny Stevens later recalled people who looked like skeletons trying to smile, trying to wave, some crying. The troops gave everything they could, rations, chocolate, what little they had. The symbolism was stark. Men whom Nazi doctrine labeled inferior were setting free victims of racial hatred. A 17-year-old survivor, Sonia Schreiber-Vitesse, immortalized the moment in a poem titled The Black Messiah, describing a black GI at the doorway whom she believed would save her. By late April and early May 1945, the 761st was among the first U.S. units to link up with Soviet forces. Accounts vary on the exact date, placing the meeting between April 26th and May 6th. One tanker, Leonard Smith, remembered a stout Russian woman crew member rushing up, shouting, "America! America!" and hugging him so tightly he could hardly breathe. Soviet troops, including female tankers, showed no surprise at seeing black Americans. To them, the color of allies mattered less than the fact they were fellow fighters against Nazism. The 761st's record is stark. 183 consecutive days of combat from November 7, 1944 to May 6, 1945 across 6 countries: France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Germany, and Austria, and in multiple major campaigns: northern France, Rhineland, Ardennes, Alsace, and Central Europe. According to records, including those cited by the National World War II Museum, the battalion inflicted roughly 4,000 enemy casualties, destroyed hundreds of vehicles, knocked out pillboxes and machine gun emplacements, and captured anti-tank guns. The unit suffered heavy losses itself, nearly a 50% casualty rate, beginning with an initial complement of about 36 officers, 30 black, 6 white, and 676 enlisted men, and losing some 71 tanks in total. Awards included the posthumous Medal of Honor for Ruben Rivers in 1997, 7 Silver Stars, around 70 Bronze Stars, and roughly 246 300 Purple Hearts. While German documents that name the 761st explicitly are relatively few, reactions to Black American soldiers are well documented in interrogation reports and military archives. One surrendering German officer, incredulous, asked how many Negro Panzer divisions there were. Upon learning there was only one battalion, he refused to believe it. The Panthers' constant presence over 183 days gave the impression of a much larger formation. Interrogation transcripts held in the U.S. National Archives record Wehrmacht soldiers struggling to reconcile their training with what they had seen. One captured sergeant told interrogators, "We were told the Negroes would run at the first shot. Instead, they kept coming even when we knocked out their tanks. This was not what we expected." The war in Europe formally ended on May 8, 1945, but the 761st's challenges continued. Like other veterans, they wrestled with traumatic memories. Unlike many white soldiers, black veterans returned to an America still segregated and hostile. Texas Native Staff Sergeant Floyd Dade Jr. captured the contradiction in an oral history. "We didn't have equal rights. Democracy was against us." Men who had destroyed enemy tanks and liberated camps came home to segregated restaurants, buses where they had to sit in the back, and the threat of racial violence. In many places, German prisoners of war were treated better than the black GIs who had captured them. For more than 3 decades, the 761st's accomplishments went largely unrecognized as a unit. Individual decorations were given, but the unit-level Presidential Unit Citation awarded promptly to many white battalions was withheld. It was not until January 24, 1978, that President Jimmy Carter presented the Presidential Unit Citation to the 761st, lauding their extraordinary gallantry, courage, professionalism, and esprit displayed during exceptionally hazardous operations. The highest honor finally arrived in 1997 when 7 members of the battalion, including Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers, were posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. More than 50 years after the fighting, on January 12, 1997, Rivers' medal was presented. President Clinton observed at the ceremony that no African American who merited the Medal of Honor for World War II had received it at the time, and that the ceremony was meant to correct that omission and honor a group of men who loved peace but had been forced to wage war. One striking change was General Patton's shift in judgment. Once doubtful of black tank crews' ability to handle the demands of armored warfare, he came to rely on them in ways that proved his confidence. During the Battle of the Bulge, when German raiders disguised themselves as American guards to ambush soldiers at checkpoints, Patton ordered black troops, including elements of the 761st, to man those posts, and gave strict instructions to shoot any white soldier behaving suspiciously. That order placed critical responsibility for the Army's security in the hands of men he had earlier doubted, and by war's end, Patton had recommended the battalion for many honors. His personal views on race remained complicated, but his professional verdict was clear. The 761st was among his finest units. The prejudice that had delayed their deployment and forced the battalion to train for nearly 2 years, rather than a few months, accidentally became an asset. While white armored units often shipped out after 12-16 weeks, the Panthers' extended preparation made them extraordinarily ready for combat. They learned every system of their Shermans, could perform maintenance under extreme conditions, and forged a tight unit cohesion that comes from long service together. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates later said that the delay, wrong and racist as it was, resulted in one of the best-trained tank battalions in the Army. The individual stories of endurance and initiative were numerous. Warren G. Crey, nicknamed Iron Man, survived the war despite multiple wounds and was responsible for destroying large amounts of enemy equipment. When Crey's tank was knocked out in one action, instead of withdrawing, he manned a .50 caliber machine gun on a half-track to cover his crew's escape. He repeatedly volunteered for the riskiest missions and often led foot reconnaissance behind enemy lines. Like many veterans, he returned with heavy burdens and only saw broader recognition years later, after the battalion's Presidential Unit Citation in 1978. Mechanical skill was another area that surprised German observers. Nazi propaganda had insisted black soldiers could not handle complex machines, yet the 761st kept an unusually high percentage of tanks operational. That was due both to their long training and the devotion of men like technician 5th grade William Harvey, who could diagnose engine faults by ear. Maintenance teams worked overnight and under fire to get Shermans back into the fight. So German reports sometimes noted with bafflement that supposedly ruined tanks reappeared days later, fully serviceable. Facing superior German heavy tanks, the Panthers developed clever tactics to overcome raw firepower. Knowing their 75mm guns could not reliably pierce frontal armor on Panthers and Tigers, they perfected coordinated flanking maneuvers, sometimes called cat hunting, where one Sherman would draw fire to mark the enemy, and two others would sprint to hit the thinner side or rear armor. Those moves demanded precise timing and courage. The bait vehicle was often lost, but the tactic was effective enough that other American armored units studied and adopted it. The 761st also played a key role in relieving besieged American forces during the Bulge. Their contribution to breaking the German encirclement of Bastogne is less celebrated than Patton's overall relief operation, but was vital. In brutal winter conditions, with temperatures plunging toward -20°F, their Shermans punched through German lines and helped free surrounded paratroopers who later recalled they didn't care about color. They simply saw their saviors as the most welcome sight. The battalion produced numerous combat leaders who earned respect by competence rather than rank alone. Officers, such as Captain Erwin McHenry, Captain John Long, and Lieutenant Charles Barber, won trust through sound decisions under fire. Company A's commander, Captain David Williams, submitted more Medal of Honor recommendations for his men than any other leader in the unit, though many nominations were downgraded or ignored at the time and only properly acknowledged decades later. Close cooperation with infantry units amplified the Panthers' effectiveness. Initially met with prejudice, the tankers quickly gained the confidence of foot soldiers. During the assault on Kleimbach, white infantrymen specifically requested 761st support after seeing what the tanks could do. Their willingness to provide perilous close support saved many lives. One infantry sergeant wrote home that the colored tank boys had rescued his unit countless times, driving into enemy fire to shield the infantry. The battalion's high tempo of combat showed in logistics as well. They expended vast quantities of ammunition, over 300 tons during the deployment, but that fire was disciplined and accurate, a product of long practice rather than recklessness. German after-action notes often remarked on the precision of tank fire in sectors where the 761st operated. A chronic problem for the Panthers was replacement personnel. The segregated army had a limited pool of trained black tank crewmen. So many reinforcements were green recruits or cast-offs from other units and not ready for frontline service. That shortage meant veterans could not be cycled out for rest. Exhausted crews kept fighting because there was no qualified relief, which helped explain both their heroism and their heavy casualty rate. The battalion's successes also undermined Nazi propaganda. Wehrmacht morale reports from early 1945 show growing doubt among troops who had faced black American units and could not reconcile their experience with racist doctrine. Before going overseas, the 761st had trained under Jim Crow conditions in southern U.S. posts like Camp Hood, where the men endured constant racial harassment, segregated buses, refusal of service by local businesses, and being quartered in the worst areas of base housing. That shared adversity forged a solidarity and resolve. They understood they were fighting two wars, one against the enemy in Europe and another against the racism back home. And that dual purpose hardened a determination German soldiers could neither fathom nor defeat. The most renowned member of the 761st was First Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt, Jackie Robinson. During training, a white bus driver ordered Robinson to move to the back. He refused and was arrested. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates declined to pursue court-martial charges brought by the MP, but the post commander moved Robinson to the 758th Tank Battalion, where an officer agreed to sign the insubordination charge. Robinson was court-martialed and ultimately acquitted, but the legal ordeal cost him a place with the 761st's deployment to Europe. He was honorably discharged in November 1944 and would, in 1947, break Major League Baseball's color barrier. On November 10, 2005, a memorial to the 761st Tank Battalion was dedicated at Fort Hood, now Fort Cavazos, Texas. The monument consists of 4 black granite panels encircling a life-size marble sculpture of a 761st tanker kneeling atop a black granite plinth etched with a tank on one side and a panther on the other. Surviving veterans, family members, and military leaders attended the dedication, and speakers emphasized that the battalion fought not only to defeat Nazi Germany, but to prove that Americans of every race could serve with honor. Perhaps the most powerful affirmation of the 761st's reputation came from former adversaries. In the 1990s, U.S. military historians interviewing Wehrmacht veterans about tank battles repeatedly heard the same evaluation. German veterans, asked to name the most formidable American tank units they'd met, frequently singled out the Black Panthers for their ferocity and skill. These were acknowledgments from men with no incentive to praise former enemies. One German tank leader tersely observed, "They fought like devils." Many Germans later admitted they could not fathom why men their country had treated as inferior would fight so fiercely, only later recognizing that those men had much to prove, and had proven it. The human toll the 761st paid was heavy. With a casualty rate approaching 50%, families received telegrams telling them that sons, husbands, and fathers had fallen while serving a nation that denied them full civil rights. Still, survivors seldom expressed bitterness. Leonard Smith, who later worked for New York City Transit, said in a 1995 interview that they were fighting for the America they hoped could exist, not the one they returned to. For decades, the 761st's story remained largely unknown outside black communities. When history texts mentioned African American service at all, they usually highlighted support roles rather than frontline combat units. That began to change during the Civil Rights era as scholars and activists worked to recover suppressed histories. The 1978 Presidential Unit Citation brought renewed attention, and the 1997 Medal of Honor recognitions amplified it further. Today, the 761st is acknowledged as one of the most effective armored units in the European campaign. Its actions studied at the U.S. Army Armor School and commemorated in museums. The battalion's legacy remains pertinent. Their experience shows how prejudice squanders talent. The Army's reluctance to employ black soldiers in combat nearly deprived the nation of an elite tank battalion. Their story also demonstrates that skill and valor cannot be extinguished by discrimination. Despite enduring systemic racism at home and brutal enmity abroad, the men of the 761st achieved extraordinary feats through training, bravery, and resolve. Their example compels us to interrogate present-day assumptions. If Nazi Germany's racial doctrines were so catastrophically wrong, what beliefs do we hold now that might be equally false? The 761st's battlefield record helped make the case for integrated armed forces. When President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948 to desegregate the military, the combat performance of units like the 761st was cited as evidence that segregation undermined effectiveness. During the Korean War, integrated units' success further validated lessons the Panthers had demonstrated. Competence and courage cross racial lines. Many 761st veterans later advised on integration, sharing hard-won insights from their wartime service. After the war, the men of the 761st followed diverse paths. Some, such as E.G. McConnell, used the GI Bill to obtain educations that had previously been out of reach. Others confronted persistent barriers in jobs and housing despite their records of service. Warren G. Crey, the battalion's Iron Man, lived with what would now be called PTSD and rarely spoke of his ordeals until public recognition began to arrive decades later. The fuller story of the 761st has been reconstructed from Army reports, German archives, letters and diaries, and oral histories collected in later years. The official U.S. Army history of the 1950s barely noted the battalion. It took independent historians and the veterans themselves to preserve and publicize their record. The 761st's liberation of the Gunskirchen camp is remembered at Yad Vashem in Israel, and survivors maintained ties with battalion members and their families. In 2015, Austria invited surviving Panthers to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the war's end, honoring them not only as liberators but as exemplars of humanity amid atrocity. The Tigers and Panthers of the Wehrmacht did not expect the Black Panthers to fight at all, let alone sustain operations for 183 days without relief. Nazi doctrine claimed black men could not operate tanks, lacked courage, and would flee under fire. Instead, German soldiers faced troops who had trained longer, endured more, and fought harder than nearly any other American unit. The 761st did far more than assist in defeating Nazi Germany. By their performance, they demolished the regime's racist assumptions through irrefutable excellence. From their first combat to VE Day, the 761st's decorations, 7 silver stars, roughly 246 Purple Hearts, and 1 posthumous Medal of Honor, only begin to indicate the depth of their sacrifice. Many honors delayed by prejudice. They fought 183 consecutive days, not because they were immune to exhaustion or loss, but because they carried the expectations and dignity of millions of Black Americans denied equality. Every Sherman they drove into action bore more than ammunition. It bore representation, the burden of proof, and a determination to show that courage and competence are not the province of any one race. Each German position they overran struck not only at enemy forces but at entrenched racial bias in both foe and ally. The men labeled inferior by Nazi propaganda revealed themselves to be exemplary soldiers. Those who had supposedly lacked the ability to handle complex machinery mastered armored warfare. Ultimately, the greatest victory of the 761st was not measured only in towns taken or tanks destroyed, but in the incontrovertible demonstration that excellence is rooted in training, resolve, and character.